No, I'm here. I'm at work and I've been running around. I
Okay.
was in the car before.
Well, your
So,
time has come. What's your question?
so tiny bit of context, but my best friend and I both he was I guess you could say, a believer, raised in church throughout his whole life. Myself, not until after college, but he would say that he kind of had a resurgence in his faith around the same time that I came to belief. It's when we became best friends, playing tennis together at the University of Mississippi. Go Rebs! And the kind of first, I came through the sort of Jordan Peterson, this little corner, started listening to you quite early, Paul Anleitner, kind of that stream of a lot of content online.
Yep.
But then more in the practical side, kind of within my life, came through some friends, himself and my best friend included, and sort of the first resources, I guess you could say, or stream of the church that I was sort of directed to was through people like John Mark Comer. That conversation you commented on a few weeks ago, and threw him pretty quickly into the sort of Dallas Willard, Richard Foster kind of spiritual formation. And so I've sort of had on one hand physically going to evangelical mega churches in Texas where I live. I'm a coach at Baylor in Waco, so sort of a mecca of the sort of Southern Baptist megachurch movement. And in Dallas, that's where I've been going to church, met my wife, amazing experience, a lot of amazing people. On the other hand, very much a lurker in this little corner and listening kind of, nonstop for probably 4 years now. And then maybe a third thing would be reading a lot of the more Dallas Willard, Richard Foster tradition. And so I guess my question would be, and this has been a topic of discussion between my best friend and I lately, is, where or some thoughts from you on the sort of gap, I guess, what he and I have been talking about, have identified of older men, specifically men within the church, and sort of relationships between older men who are not pastors or priests necessarily and younger men, not necessarily their sons, within the church that are, from the Comer and Newhoff conversation, sort of that discussion of stages 4, 5, and 6. And the necessity for these close long-term relationships. And so I'm sort of poking around the question, but do you see that as a pretty big gap? And what do you see as, maybe, I don't know, potential solution is sort of a big thing to ask for, but, that's kind of all the inputs there. And we've just been talking a lot about that because we both felt that as a felt need in our life and a lack as well, and not necessarily wanting to cross over into the therapeutic, like I hear your critiques of John Mark and that strain and the tendency towards the therapeutic. And so, just curious if you have any thoughts on that quickly.
I do. That is a great question. So part of what happened in the counterculture and the rise of the Jesus movement I think in a lot of ways, the breakdown of the American church began in the Jesus movement and the counterculture. And what you began having was churches that were segmented by generations, demographic generations. And so obviously the Jesus movement tended to be younger people. Now they're boomers now, but they were younger people coming in. And after that, you had waves of church planting. So the Jesus people seeds, the seeker movement, and Pasadena, the church growth movement, which had an ideology of birds of a feather flock together. And so you had the Jesus movement, you had the born again movement, the rise of the evangelicals, you had the seeker movement, and that all sort of starts to come undone with the boomers. And behind the boomers, you have the X's with the emergent movement, which sort of splits between kind of a mainline revival. Nadia Bolz-Weber would sort of be a headliner for that. And then a young, restless, and reformed, which would be like Mark Driscoll and the Young, Restless, and Reformed. And then you have the John
and all the
Mark
churches where I'm
Comer
at. Yeah.
that are sort of in between, because, people don't think about Rob Bell, Mark Driscoll, Nadia Boltz-Weber. They're all in the same generational cohort. And John Mark Comer, they're all in the same generational cohort. And so then you get this wave again of, every time we planted churches in Sacramento, it was always young people, young families. And the older churches were over here. And so then very quickly, some of the people were looking around and saying, we have all this wisdom dying in older churches. Younger women were looking for older women to mentor them. Younger men were looking for older men to mentor them. And actually, when we got the Jordan Peterson, then estuary movement going, one of the things that we got from a lot of the young guys who started coming to it were, I'm here because I want to find older men to listen to that are not clergy. And I think I've never heard this point made before, but I think actually one of the key elements that have made the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement go, especially in a church like the PCA or in the Acts 29 networks, was that Presbyterian form of government had lifelong eldership only for men. And so what that produced in a lot of PCA churches were older men who were mature in the faith, then discipling younger men. And they had to be men because it was the PCA. So I think one of the reasons that Acts 29 and the PCA and the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement flourished, and has flourished in the way that it has, it's got plenty of its own problems too, but is exactly this point. And now it's going to be interesting to see if this is a strength of complementarian churches. What I mean by that is churches that won't allow women leadership. Because what then it tends to happen is that because women are sort of barred this entrance into the institution, they sort of set up the dual tracks. And this is what I saw in churches and other cultures, in Korean churches, in Hispanic churches, where generally speaking, they wouldn't go complementarian, is that you'd more often have older men mentoring younger men and older women mentoring younger women. Now, how this is going to play out in American Orthodoxy will be interesting to watch. But that is, I think, an element of conservatism and what's going to be happening there. So does that answer your question at all?
Yeah. I think that provides a ton of context, and it rings true in the sense of a lot of the churches I've been around, both as a member and then just friends. I was in Dallas for years, and so you have a mix of the Matt Chandlers as well as a bunch of other Acts 29 churches with more Baptist churches. And they have these slight differences, but there's a lot of similarities, especially theologically, really, because the pastors, if they sit down, they could hash out the differences they have, but the bodies of the church are largely, especially young people, are largely formed through relationships like what you're talking about. And because of the thirst for those relationships with older men, and I'm not saying this is a negative, I might disagree with some things, but the theology tends to be shaped in the same way, right? Like through the Young, Restless, and Reformed. And it's often, if you dig a little bit past the surface of why do you believe, or why are you in this particular tradition, or have you thought about these things, you pretty quickly realize it's like, oh, well, this was, my dad and my dad's friends, and the only men that I knew who were ever going to invest in me, and so these men invested in me, and that's why I am, I believe in Jesus, and I have this life, and maybe that's how I met my wife, and all these kinds of things at these churches. And so, it's a communal thing, like you talk about all the time. It just, for my friend and I, it puts you in a little bit of a strange situation if you are, fully committed to the church, but not necessarily fully committed to all of the axioms and the propositions, and that can get a little bit in the way of that more sort of discipleship relationship that you're talking about past the first couple stages. So anyways,
great question.
I appreciate it.
Great question. Thanks for jumping on. Good to see you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah.
All right.